they kicked out a 12-year-old girl for being pregnant. She returned after years and shocked everyone. The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the narrow streets of the small town. Inside a modest house, the air was thick with tension. Lena, a frail 12-year-old girl, stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling as she clutched the hem of her tattered dress. Her father, Mr. Kapoor, loomed over her, his face red with fury, while her mother, Mrs. Kapoor, sat in the corner, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "How could you do this to us?" Mr. Kapoor roared, slamming his fist on the wooden table. The sound echoed through the room, making Lena flinch. "At just 12 years old, you've brought shame to this family. Do you have any idea what people will say?" Lena's voice was barely a whisper, choked with tears. "Papa, I didn't mean to. I didn't know what was happening." Mrs. Kapoor stood abruptly, her voice sharp and cutting. "Don't call him Papa. You're no longer our daughter. Get out of this house. Now." Lena fell to her knees, her small hands reaching out to her mother. "Ma, please, I have nowhere to go." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Mr. Kapoor grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her to the door. The cold rain hit her face like a slap as he shoved her out into the night. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound final and unforgiving. Lena stood there, soaked and shivering, her mind numb with shock. She clutched her stomach where a tiny life was growing and whispered to herself, "Where will I go? What will I do?" For days, Lena wandered the streets, seeking shelter wherever she could find it. She faced hunger, judgment, and danger at every turn. One night, as she huddled under a tree in a park, an elderly woman approached her. The woman, Mrs. Mehta, had kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Child, you can't stay out here in the cold," Mrs. Mehta said, holding out her hand. "Come with me." Lena hesitated, but the warmth in Mrs. Mehta's voice gave her a glimmer of hope. She took the woman's hand and followed her to a small, cozy house on the edge of town. Mrs. Mehta, a retired teacher, became Lena's guardian, helping her through her pregnancy and encouraging her to stay strong. "Life will test you, Lena," Mrs. Mehta often said, "but you must rise above it. This child is your strength, not your weakness." Months later, Lena gave birth to a baby girl whom she named Anvi. Despite the challenges, Lena found hope in her daughter. She vowed to build a better life for them both, no matter how hard it would be. Years passed, and Lena, now 25, had transformed into a confident and independent woman. With Mrs. Mehta's guidance, she had completed her education and started a small business selling handmade crafts. Her talent and determination turned her business into a success, and she and Anvi lived a comfortable life. But the pain of her past still lingered, a shadow that never quite left her. One evening, as Lena and Anvi sat together in their cozy home, Anvi asked a question that Lena had been dreading. "Mama, why don't we ever visit your family? Don't you have parents?" Lena paused, her heart heavy with emotion. She looked at Anvi, her daughter's bright eyes filled with curiosity and innocence. "Some stories are too painful to tell, my love, but one day I'll explain everything." Anvi nodded, sensing her mother's discomfort, and changed the subject. But the question lingered in Lena's mind, stirring up memories she had tried to bury. That night, as Lena lay in bed, she thought about her parents. She wondered if they ever regretted their decision to throw her out. She wondered if they ever thought about her, or the granddaughter they had never met. The next morning, Lena received a letter that would change everything. It was from her aunt, informing her that her father, Mr. Kapoor, was critically ill. The letter urged Lena to come home, if only to say goodbye. Lena's hands trembled as she read the words. She hadn't seen her parents in over a decade, and the thought of facing them again filled her with a mix of anger, fear, and longing. "What's wrong, Mama?" Anvi asked, noticing her mother's distress. Lena took a deep breath and sat down beside her daughter. "Anvi, there's something I need to tell you. A long time ago, before you were born, I lived in a small town with my parents. But they didn't understand me, and they sent me away. Now my father is very sick, and I need to go back to see him. Anvi's eyes widened. You mean I have grandparents? Can I come with you? Lena hesitated, then nodded. Yes, my love. It's time you met them. The journey back to her hometown was bittersweet. As Lena and Anvi stepped off the bus, the familiar sights and smells of the small town brought back a flood of memories. The streets were still narrow, the houses still modest, but everything felt different now. The townspeople stared in shock as they recognized Lena. Whispers followed them wherever they went. Is that Lena? The girl they kicked out for being pregnant. Look at her now. She's so confident. And who's that girl with her? Lena ignored the whispers and made her way to her childhood home. Her heart pounded as she stood at the door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. Her mother, Mrs. Kapoor, now aged and frail, opened the door. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw Lena standing there. Lena, is that really you? Mrs. Kapoor asked, her voice trembling. Yes, it's me, Lena replied calmly but firmly. I've come to see him. Mrs. Kapoor stepped aside, allowing Lena and Anvi to enter. The house was exactly as Lena remembered it, but it felt smaller now, as if the walls had closed in over the years. Lena stood by her father's bedside. Mr. Kapoor, weak and barely able to speak, looked at her with regret in his eyes. Lena, I'm sorry. I was wrong. He whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears filled Lena's eyes, but she remained composed. She introduced Anvi to her parents. This is my daughter. Anvi, Lena said, her voice steady. She's the reason I survived. She's the reason I'm standing here today. Mrs. Kapoor broke down, realizing the pain she had caused. The townspeople, who had once judged Lena, now looked at her with respect and admiration. Lena and Anvi arrived in the small town where Lena had grown up. The townspeople stared in shock, whispering among themselves as they recognized the girl who had been cast out all those years ago. Is that Lena? The girl they kicked out for being pregnant. Look at her now. She's so confident. And who's that girl with her? Lena ignored the whispers and made her way to her childhood home. Her mother, Mrs. Kapoor, now aged and frail, gasped when she saw her daughter standing at the door. Lena, is that really you? Mrs. Kapoor asked, her voice trembling. Yes, it's me, Lena replied calmly but firmly. I've come to see him. Lena stood by her father's bedside. Mr. Kapoor, weak and barely able to speak, looked at her with regret in his eyes. Lena, I'm sorry. I was wrong. He whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears filled Lena's eyes, but she remained composed. She introduced Anvi to her parents. This is my daughter. Anvi, Lena said, her voice steady. She's the reason I survived. She's the reason I'm standing here today. Mrs. Kapoor broke down, realizing the pain she had caused. The townspeople, who had once judged Lena, now looked at her with respect and admiration. Lena organized a community event to showcase her business and share her story. The entire town gathered, including those who had once shunned her. Years ago, I was thrown out of this town for a mistake I didn't fully understand, Lena said, addressing the crowd. But today, I stand here not as a victim, but as a survivor. I've learned that our past doesn't define us. What defines us is how we rise after we fall. The crowd erupted in applause. Mrs. Kapoor stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Lena, I was wrong, she said, her voice breaking. I let fear and pride blind me. Can you ever forgive me? Lena paused, then embraced her mother. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about healing. And today, I choose to heal. Lena, Anvi, and Mrs. Kapoor walked hand in hand through the town. The once judgmental townspeople now smiled and waved. Lena's story became a symbol of resilience and redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. As they walked, Anvi looked up at her mother and smiled. "Mama, I'm proud of you." Lena smiled back, her heart full. "And I'm proud of us, my love. We've come a long way." The rain had stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the town. It was a new beginning, not just for Lena and her family, but for everyone who had witnessed her journey. The next morning, Lena woke up early and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Anvi was still asleep, and Mrs. Kapoor was sitting at the table, sipping tea. "Good morning, Ma," Lena said, her voice warm. Mrs. Kapoor looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Good morning, Lena. I was just thinking about how much you've grown. I'm so proud of you." Lena smiled, but her heart was heavy with the weight of the past. "Ma, I've forgiven you, but I need to know, why did you and Papa throw me out? Why didn't you stand by me?" Mrs. Kapoor sighed, her hands trembling as she set down her cup. "We were afraid, Lena, afraid of what people would say, afraid of the shame it would bring to our family. But we were wrong. We let fear and pride blind us, and we lost you because of it." Lena sat down beside her mother, taking her hand. "I understand, Ma, but I need you to understand something too. What happened to me wasn't my fault. I was just a child, and I didn't know what was happening. I needed you, and you weren't there." Mrs. Kapoor's eyes filled with tears. "I know, Lena, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I'll do everything I can to make it up to you and Anvi." Lena nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "Thank you, Ma. That's all I've ever wanted." Later that day, Lena and Anvi visited Mr. Kapoor's grave. Lena knelt down, placing a bouquet of flowers on the ground. "Papa, I forgive you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I hope you found peace." Anvi stood beside her, her small hand resting on Lena's shoulder. "Mama, do you think he's watching over us?" Lena looked up at the sky, the sun shining brightly. "Yes, my love, I think he is." As the days passed, Lena and her family began to heal. Mrs. Kapoor moved in with them, and the 3 generations lived together in harmony. Lena's business continued to thrive, and she became a role model for other women in the town. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Anvi asked, "Mama, what do you think the future holds for us?" Lena smiled, her heart full of hope. "The future is whatever we make of it, my love. And I know that no matter what happens, we'll face it together." The sun set, casting a warm glow over the town. It was a new beginning, not just for Lena and her family, but for everyone who had witnessed her journey.